Eleanor Marsh had been awake since 4. That was her habit, one she had held for close to 40 years, long before age had made early waking unavoidable. She rose before the house stirred, before the neighbor's dog started up on Calloway Street, before the light outside the kitchen window changed from black to the particular pale gray that came an hour before dawn. She made tea. Earl Grey, 2 minutes, no sugar, the way she had made it every morning since she was 23, and Gerald had teased her about it, called it the most stubborn thing about her, which was saying something. She stood at the counter and held the mug in both hands and looked out at the back garden, at Gerald's roses in the early dark, orange and deep red, at the bird feeder she had refilled every Thursday for as long as she could remember, at the forsythia along the back fence where a robin had been building something complicated for the past week and a half. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 77 years old. Her hands on the mug were steady. They had always been steady, built for work, for tending things, for staying at a task long after the instinct said stop. She stood at the counter in the quiet kitchen and the morning was still around her and she was not thinking about the papers her son had left on the table the night before. She was thinking about her mother. Vera Alcott had been dead 15 years, but Eleanor had been reaching back toward her lately the way you reach for a railing in the dark. Vera had been a spare woman. Not cold, but economical, the way someone becomes when they have thought seriously about things and stopped needing to perform. She used words like she used her good kitchen tools, deliberately, without waste, and she had a quality of stillness about her that Eleanor had spent most of her life trying to learn and never quite managed. She told Eleanor once, when Eleanor was perhaps 12 and had been crying over something she could no longer name, that grief was not the same as losing. You can carry something heavy, Vera said, and still walk forward. The two things are not the same. Eleanor set her mug on the counter and crossed the kitchen and picked up the papers Daniel had left the night before. She had not read them then. She had watched her son set them down on the table, had watched him arrange his face into careful concern, had listened to him explain in the measured tone he had developed in his 40s, the tone of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and anticipated where the difficulty would come. She had sat very still and looked at him and nodded at the right moments. She had not picked up the papers. Now she read them. The house on Birchwood Lane had passed to Daniel when Gerald died. She had known this, or believed she had. Gerald's affairs had not been well organized when his heart gave out 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in the driveway, unloading groceries, gone in the time it took for Eleanor to wonder why he had been so long outside. The weeks after were the fog that comes with sudden widowhood, a state in which you function but do not quite inhabit your own life. Daniel had managed everything. The paperwork, the accounts, the lawyer's appointments. She had signed what he put in front of her and had not read carefully because she had been in no condition to read carefully, and because he was her son, and she trusted him. She had believed that trust made precision unnecessary. The papers clarified what she had not understood when she signed. 60 days. A notice of termination of occupancy. The house had been sold, the closing contingent on vacant possession by the 15th of September. The document was 31 pages of legal language, measured and correct, and contained no cruelty. This, she thought, was almost worse than cruelty would have been. There was no place in those pages for the feeling that had begun in her chest, rising slowly, like water finding its level. At the back of the envelope were brochures for 2 assisted living communities. Ashwood Gardens in Clemson, 14 miles away. The Pines at Laurel Hill, closer. She set the brochures aside without opening them. She thought about Courtney. 6 months ago, on the phone, her daughter-in-law's voice pleasant the way it always was, that particular pleasantness built from practice rather than feeling. Mother, I hope you've been thinking about your long-term situation. You can't stay in that house forever. Forever. The way she had used that word, wrapped in something that resembled concern. Courtney was 44 years old and deeply efficient, a woman of organized appetites who had understood from early in the marriage what Daniel stood to inherit and had been patient and strategic in working toward it. Eleanor had taken her calls. Had even appreciated some of what Courtney said, in the abstract, the way you appreciate advice that seems to apply to someone other than yourself. She had not recognized it for what it was because she had not wanted to. That, she could acknowledge now. She had not wanted to. She thought about Daniel as a boy. He had been a gentle child in ways he had spent 30 years methodically concealing. He had cried at films until he was 12. He had kept a bird notebook, had been stubborn about honesty to a degree that had occasionally caused problems in school. She had looked at that boy and been unable to picture the man who would leave papers on his mother's kitchen table and call it concern. People were capable of many things you could not see ahead of time. She supposed she had believed that love was a different kind of protection than it turned out to be. She refilled her tea. She went upstairs. At the back of her bedroom closet, behind the winter coats, was the cardboard box she had carried from house to house since she was in her 20s. Inside, photographs, Gerald's old tax documents in rubber-banded stacks, Christmas cards from people most of whom were now gone. At the bottom of the box, in a manila envelope she had not opened in 15 years, was a deed. Vera had left it to Eleanor specifically. Not to Raymond, Eleanor's older brother, who had expected the bulk of the inheritance. Raymond had received the practical things, the savings, the car, the furniture, and had been quiet about his bitterness without managing to conceal it. He had said once, at a dinner that became an argument, what would Eleanor do with a rundown farmhouse on a back road anyway? He had not been wrong, at the time. She had not had an answer then. She read the deed now. 12 acres on Grover Road. A farmhouse, 2 stories, built in the 1920s. A barn and outbuildings. Her name. Recorded in the county register in 1989 and never altered since, never transferred, never raised in any of the legal arrangements after Gerald's death because it had never come up, because she had not thought to raise it, because it was the thing everyone including herself had regarded as the least valuable piece of anything in the inheritance. An old farmhouse on a gravel road that had been empty for 30 years. It was hers. Entirely, completely hers. She held the deed for several minutes. Then she went downstairs and called Daniel. He answered quickly. She could hear Courtney's voice in the background, then silence as a door was closed. He said, "Mom, I'm glad you called." She said, "I've read the papers. I understand the situation. I wanted to let you know I'll be out before the 15th. He said, "Where are you planning to go?" She said, "Your grandmother's old place on Grover Road." There was a pause then, the specific kind of silence that follows a disrupted expectation. He said, "Mom, that farmhouse is a ruin. You cannot live out there." She said, "I'll manage." She kept her voice even. He said her name twice, the second time with something that might have been guilt or might have been frustration. She did not stay on the line long enough to determine which. She said, "Give Courtney my love." She spent 62 days preparing. Not in grief, not in panic, but working through the house on Birchwood Lane the way Vera would have done, methodically, without waste. She sorted everything: give, sell, store, keep. She was surprised, in the end, by how small the keep pile was. Not because the house had not held things she loved, but because the things she loved turned out to be fewer and more specific than she had known. Gerald's watch, which she had not wound since he died but had not been able to return to the drawer either. The wedding quilt Vera had pieced the winter before Eleanor's marriage. The photograph from their honeymoon in Nova Scotia in 1971, both of them squinting into September sea light, Gerald's arm around her, her hair doing something the wind had decided. Her grandmother's teacups, 6 of them, nested in sweaters in a box. Her kitchen knives. One good heavy pot. Biscuit's blue blanket, which he had claimed 2 years ago and would not have surrendered under any circumstances. Her books, 4 boxes. She sold the furniture at an estate sale over a weekend in August. She gave her neighbor Maria the garden perennials, carefully dug and potted, because she could not leave them to whatever came next and could not take them. She put the rest in a storage unit paid 3 months ahead. On the last morning, she walked through the house alone with nothing in her hands. Through the kitchen where she had made 41 years of meals. The bedroom. The study that had been a study, then a sewing room, then nothing in particular. She went out into the back garden and stood among Gerald's roses in the early light, the red ones he had planted first, then the pale pink, then the white climber she had put in herself after the funeral because she had needed somewhere to put her hands. She stood there until she was ready. Then she picked up Biscuit in his carrier and walked out and did not look back at the house because she knew that if she looked back she would stand there too long. The drive to Grover Road took 20 minutes. East out of town on county routes she had known since childhood, the land opening from neighborhood to farm fields to the older, quieter stretch where the trees grew close to the road and the properties ran back past what you could see from the car. The gravel lane at the end was overgrown on both sides with blackberry cane. The iron gate hung rusted half open, a Virginia creeper threading through its bars. The man she had hired with his truck stopped and looked through the windshield at the farmhouse and said, "You sure this is the right place?" Eleanor said, "This is the right place." She paid him extra to carry boxes inside without comment. The porch was worse than she remembered from the visit 6 years earlier with Gerald. 3 boards had broken through entirely, the others soft enough to flex under her weight. One front window had cracked diagonally from corner to corner, the glass still seated but fractured. The paint had reduced itself over 30 years to a thin gray film over weathered wood. The gutters on the south side had pulled free and hung at a steep angle. The yard was a meadow, goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace waist-high in places, a volunteer elm grown to 15 feet in what had once been a front garden border. She did not let herself catalogue what was wrong. She looked at what was there. They entered through the back. The kitchen had a cast-iron sink, a 1950s propane cook stove, a table that had listed to one side as a leg slowly failed over the decades, and shelves along the far wall that were hand-pegged and had not shifted. The ceiling was pressed tin in a clover pattern, dented in 2 spots but complete. The floor was wide plank oak under decades of dust, and when she scuffed a section clear with her boot heel, the grain came up dark and warm. The walls were plaster, cracked along one seam but dry. The smell was old wood and old air, and beneath it something sweeter, a faint trace Eleanor could not immediately place, dried herbs or the memory of cooking, something Vera had done in this kitchen long ago and whose ghost was still present in the close air. She found matches on the shelf and lit the cookstove burner and put her kettle on. The man and his helper carried the boxes to the downstairs bedroom, the one with the east window. She thanked them and paid them and watched the truck back out down the lane until it disappeared around the first bend. Then she stood in the kitchen alone with the kettle beginning to sound, and Biscuit pressing methodically along the baseboards on his initial survey, and the afternoon light coming in through glass that had not been cleaned in 30 years. She was not all right, not quite. But she was here. That was something. She carried her tea to the front hall and stood at the bottom of the stairs. They were original, narrow and steep, the banister worn smooth by hands over 100 years. At the top, a landing, 2 bedroom doors she had been in before. And at the far end of the upstairs hall, narrower than the others, the attic door. Vera had always kept it locked. Eleanor had asked about it once, when she was 8 or 9, the age when locked things are irresistible. Vera had considered the question for a moment in that particular way she had, as though a question deserved the respect of genuine thought before answering. Then she had said, "There are things up there that aren't ready to be seen yet." Eleanor had accepted this the way a child accepts what a calm parent says with certainty. She had grown up and never asked again. It had simply been part of the house's facts, like the way the third stair creaked and the kitchen window stuck in the summer. She had looked for a key after Vera died. Had gone through every drawer in the apartment, every coat pocket, every tin and box and envelope in the process of clearing out. Had not found it. She had closed the farmhouse and driven away and told herself someday. She turned from the stairs and went back to the kitchen and made soup for supper. The first 2 weeks at the farmhouse were a lesson in sustained patience. The plaster on the east wall of the bedroom she chose was coming away in a 3-foot section, but the lath behind it was sound and the wall was dry. The bathroom pipes wheezed but worked, the water running brown for 10 seconds before clearing. The electrical panel had been updated in the 70s and was cautious but functional. She carried scrap lumber from the barn to bridge the worst of the porch boards, making the entrance safe. She oiled the iron gate and forced it fully open. She swept and scrubbed each room in turn, not trying to see the whole of it at once, taking the farmhouse on its own terms, room by room, a conversation rather than a confrontation. The barn, when she got into it properly, was in better shape than she had expected. A solid structure, good bones, its hardware original and intact. She found lumber, old tools, canning jars, a folding table in serviceable condition. She found, hanging on a rusted nail near the barn door, a ring with 3 keys on it, none of which she recognized. She tried each one on the attic door. None of them turned. She drove to town twice a week for groceries and hardware and propane. She stayed on the back roads, avoided the streets she associated with the life she had just left. When she ran into someone she knew, she said she was staying at her mother's old place for a while, figuring things out. This covered everything that needed covering. Daniel called once, in the middle of October. She answered. He asked how she was getting on out there. She said she was getting on well. He mentioned the brochures. She said she had not read them. He said, "Mom, I really do hope you'll think about your options." She said, "I will think about what needs thinking about." She hung up and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the goldenrod in the side yard in the afternoon light, that particular gold of late October in the south, and felt something close enough to peace that she allowed herself to call it that. 3 weeks in, she began clearing the old kitchen garden on the south side of the house. She could read the bones of it beneath the overgrowth, a rectangle edged with field stones, the soil inside it darker and richer than the surrounding ground, the kind of earth that decades of composting and tending had built into something that would grow almost anything. She started at the outer edge and worked inward with a hand fork, pulling weeds, turning earth, clearing a section each morning before the light got too low. It was good work. The kind that occupied the hands thoroughly enough that the mind could move without being noticed. She had been at it an hour on a Tuesday morning when the fork struck something in the soil that rang. Not the dull stop of a root, not the thud of a stone. A metallic sound, clean and specific. She cleared around it with her hands and lifted a tin box from the earth, the sort that had once held biscuits or tea, rectangular, sealed with a strip of electrical tape so old it had gone brittle and crumbled when she touched it. She brought it to the barn step and sat down and opened it. Inside, a small notebook, its pages yellowed at the edges but intact, and a photograph. She looked at the photograph first. A woman she did not recognize for several seconds, because the woman was young, perhaps 25, and she held herself with a quality of self-possession that Eleanor had not associated with her mother. Very straight, chin level, one arm raised mid-gesture, as though she had been in the middle of explaining something and the shutter had caught her in it. Behind her were large windows full of light, and against the wall behind those windows, canvas after canvas stacked in a long row. Eleanor looked at the eyes. Then she knew. Vera. Before Eleanor's father. Before the apartment in town. Before Eleanor. She opened the notebook. Her mother's handwriting, small and careful, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write before the war. September 12, 1957. I have never shown anyone these paintings and I do not know if I ever will. I only know I cannot stop making them. Whatever this is, it is not something I can choose to put down. Eleanor read the notebook from first page to last, sitting on the barn step while the afternoon moved around her. What she read was her mother's voice without the careful editing Vera had always applied in life, the voice of someone writing for no one, recording what was true because it needed to be recorded. Vera had been a painter. Not in the Sunday afternoon sense. Trained, serious, someone who had studied and shown work and sold it. She had worked at it for years in this farmhouse before her marriage, and then, when she married and moved to the apartment in town, she had stopped showing the work. Had stopped selling it. Had, the notebook implied, brought it back here to this farmhouse and kept it. Eleanor looked up from the notebook at the upstairs window that faced the barn. The attic window. She thought about the 30 years of property taxes she had paid on a place she had assumed held nothing worth returning for. She thought about Raymond's voice. What would Eleanor even do with an old farmhouse on a back road? She thought about Vera's handwriting on the envelope tucked into her will. You were always the patient one. This will matter when it matters. She put the notebook carefully back in the tin box. She held the box in both hands and looked at the farmhouse. Her mother had kept a 50-year silence around her own work, her own life, the self she had been before anyone had thought to define her. And she had kept that work somewhere. Had locked it away in a room at the end of a hall and had not given the key to anyone, had not, apparently, given it to anyone still living. Eleanor had 12 acres, a farmhouse she was learning room by room, and a mother who had chosen her words with great precision her entire life. You were always the patient one. She went inside. She put the kettle on. And she began, in earnest, to look for what Vera had left behind. She started with the obvious places first, because Vera had been a practical woman and practical women did not hide things in ways that could not eventually be found. The kitchen had 2 drawers that stuck and one that had swollen shut entirely in the damp of an empty house. Eleanor worked the stuck ones open and found a rubber band gone brittle, a ticket stub from 1978, a ball of string, 4 pennies, a single earring, and a notepad with a grocery list in Vera's hand that read butter, lard, dried figs, the good vinegar. Nothing else. The 3rd drawer had to be coaxed with a butter knife along the joint, and when it finally released it was empty except for a pencil stub and a folded piece of brown paper bag with a sketch of the kitchen garden on it, a plan for something never planted. Eleanor unfolded it carefully and studied the sketch for several minutes, then folded it again and put it in her cardigan pocket. She checked behind the radiator in the front hall. Under the loose board she had found in the bathroom. In the tin box on the mantelpiece that held buttons and safety pins and the detritus of decades of small domestic management. In the bedrooms upstairs she went through every drawer, the closet shelf, the space behind the closet, the window ledge behind the curtain. In the 2nd bedroom there was an old dresser that had not moved in 30 years, judging by the dark rectangle it had left on the floor. She moved it out from the wall. Nothing. She examined the attic door again. It was narrower than the others in the hall, and plainer, without the paneled detail of the bedroom doors. The lock was a simple skeleton keyhole, oval, brass, the kind that had been standard on interior doors for the first half of the century. The door fit its frame closely enough that she could not see through the gap, and when she pressed her ear to the wood and listened, she heard nothing but the faint sound of her own breath returning. She tried a pin. She tried a thin piece of wire from the barn. She was not skilled at this and knew it and did not waste more than 20 minutes on the attempt before setting it aside. She tried a credit card along the latch. She tried pressing the door in at different points to see if the frame had shifted enough to allow movement. Nothing. On the 3rd morning of looking, she drove into town and stopped at the hardware store. The man behind the counter had a name tag that read Walt and the manner of someone who had been answering questions about locks for a long time. She described the keyhole, the door, the approximate age. He looked at her for a moment and then went to the back and came out with a shallow tray of skeleton keys, 15 or 20 of them, various sizes. He said, interior skeleton locks from that period, most of them take one of maybe 6 or 7 blanks. Try these in order of size, start in the middle and work outward. She bought the tray for $12 and drove back along the gravel lane with the keys sliding against each other in their tray on the passenger seat. The middle keys did not work. She moved outward in both directions, trying each one, feeling for the catch, turning slowly, not forcing. The 9th key entered the lock fully. She turned it. The mechanism moved, old and stiff, and she had to apply steady pressure for 3 seconds before it released. The tumblers turned. The lock opened. She stood in the hall with the key in her hand and did not open the door for a moment. Whatever was in the attic had been waiting a long time. She had been patient her whole life, had learned it from Vera, who had learned it from necessity, and she applied that patience now. She thought about what the notebook had said. She thought about the photograph of young Vera with her arm raised mid-sentence, standing in front of rows of canvases, looking like a woman who had not yet learned to make herself smaller. Then she turned the handle and opened the door. The stairs beyond were steep, unfinished, the wood unpolished and gray with age. The air that came down was cold and dry and held a quality of preserved stillness, the way a held breath is different from ordinary air. She found the light switch. A single bare bulb at the top of the stairs came on, casting a flat white light. She climbed. The attic ran the full width of the house, roughly 40 feet from end to end. The floor was the same wide plank oak as below, dry and sound. The roofline came down at both ends, leaving perhaps 6 feet of standing height along the center. 2 windows, one at each gable end, faced east and west, their glass thick and wavy with age, letting in a light that arrived already softened, already old. She stood at the top of the stairs and looked. Along both long walls, stacked 3 and 4 deep against each other, wrapped in cloth and brown paper and in some cases old canvas covers tied with cord, were paintings. Dozens of them. She could see the shapes without unwrapping anything, the rectangles varying in size from small, perhaps 12 inches square, to large, 4 feet across or more. Some had the corner of a frame visible, the gilded edge of something substantial. Some were flat and unframed. They lined both walls for the full length of the attic, with additional stacks in the center arranged in rows. She counted the stacks without moving from the top of the stairs. 42 separate wrapped pieces along the left wall. 31 along the right. In the center, 2 rows of smaller works, perhaps 20 apiece. More than 100 paintings. At the far end of the attic, beneath the west window, was a work table. Old but solid, its surface stained with decades of paint in a dozen colors, the surface of it a record of everything that had been mixed and applied here. On the table, glass jars with hardened residue, a tin of linseed oil with a dried skin over the opening, 3 brushes standing handles down in a ceramic cup, bristles upward, still shaped from their last use. On the wall above the table, pinned with thumbtacks, a series of color studies on small paper rectangles, each one a careful notation of a mixed tone, the paint dry and unchanged in the sealed air. She crossed to the table and stood before it. Her mother had stood here. Many hundreds of times her mother had stood at this exact table and looked out this west window at this view, the pasture, the tree line, the particular quality of late afternoon light coming in across the open ground. She had stood here and mixed color on this surface and recorded what she saw in the way she saw it, and then she had carried the work to the walls and stacked it and covered it and locked the door. 50 years of work. Locked away. Eleanor put her hand flat on the worktable surface and felt the dried irregularities of decades of paint under her palm. She stood like that for a while. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post below the west window, looked in, decided against it, and flew away. She unwrapped the first painting. She chose it from the left wall, in the middle of the row, no particular reason. The cord was old cotton, tied in a knot that had stiffened but gave when she worked it carefully. The cloth underneath was canvas, and beneath that, brown paper. She unfolded the paper and lifted the painting out and turned it to the light from the west window. It was the pasture. The same pasture she could see from the window now, but in summer, the grass long and deep green, the tree line in full leaf, a single figure in the middle distance moving along the fence, too far away to identify but present enough to anchor the composition. The sky was the sky at roughly 4 in the afternoon, that particular blue of summer with the first suggestion of deepening at the horizon. The paint was applied in a way that was both precise and entirely alive, each mark sure, the whole surface vibrating with attention. It was not the work of a Sunday painter. It was not the work of an amateur who had done well for someone without formal training. It was the work of someone who had understood what painting was and had dedicated years to understanding it more completely. The way the light fell on the figure in the distance, the way the foreground grass was differentiated without being detailed, the temperature of the sky. Eleanor had no technical vocabulary for what she was seeing, but she did not need one. She could see it plainly. Her mother had known exactly what she was doing. She rewrapped the painting and set it against the wall and sat down on the floor beside it, because her legs had decided this was necessary. Biscuit had followed her up the stairs and now arranged himself on her feet with the conviction of a cat who believes warmth is a moral right. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She sat on the attic floor and thought about her mother. Vera Alcott had grown up in this farmhouse. Had left at 21 to study in the city, had returned at 25 with whatever she had learned and whatever she had decided about herself and her work. Had painted for years in this room. Then she had married, moved to town, and become what she became, a careful, precise, private woman who read widely and kept her own counsel and told Eleanor that grief and losing were not the same thing. Eleanor had been told, growing up, that her mother had done some painting as a young woman but had not pursued it seriously. This was how it had been explained, had not pursued it seriously. And Eleanor had accepted the explanation without examining it, the way you accept what you are told about a person's past when you do not yet know that people are capable of containing entire lives that have nothing to do with the ones you know them by. Vera had not failed to pursue it. She had pursued it here, in this room, for years, and then had locked the door on it and carried the key with her. Why? She did not know yet. The notebook had not explained it, had only said what it said, September 12, 1957, the inability to put it down. Whatever had followed, whatever decision had caused Vera to stop showing the work and lock it away, was in the silence between entries. The notebook had continued past that date, but the entries after were brief and factual, lists, observations about the garden, once a note about a leaking pipe, nothing more of the paintings. She had stopped writing about them as though she had reached a decision and had no more to say. Eleanor stood up. She helped Biscuit off her feet, which he resented. She went to the right wall and unwrapped a second painting. This one was larger, perhaps 3 feet across. A kitchen interior. Not this kitchen, she thought at first, then recognized the pressed tin ceiling and the window with its particular hinge, and understood it was this kitchen, but decades earlier, the table set for 2, a bowl of something in the center, winter light coming through the glass. The painting was about the light, really, what the winter morning did to the surface of the table, the way it struck the rim of the bowl and went flat on the wall behind. Vera had understood light the way a musician understands key, as the thing in which everything else exists. She moved through the attic more quickly after that, not unwrapping everything, but lifting corners of cloth, pulling back edges of paper, getting a sense of the scope of it. Landscapes, interiors, figures. Some portraits, small ones, intimate, people she did not recognize but who had the quality of being seen truly, not flattered, not reduced. A series of smaller works that seemed to be studies of single objects, a glass of water, a pair of hands, 3 apples on a wooden surface, each one more a conversation with light than a description of a thing. The work spanned years. She could see it in the development of the style, the early paintings more careful, more labored, the middle ones finding a sureness, the later ones, the ones nearest the work table end of the attic, looser and more confident, the mark-making direct, the choices bold. She was looking at a life's work. Decades of sustained attention and skill and making, stacked against these walls in the order it had arrived. She sat at the work table as the afternoon light shifted and thought about what she was going to do. She did not have a plan for this. She had come to the farmhouse because it was the only place that was hers, because Daniel had taken the house on Birchwood Lane and she had not known until too late that she needed to pay closer attention to what was being done in her name. She had come here because it was the only door she had a key for. She had not come here expecting to find anything except 4 walls and a roof and the particular hard work of making an old place livable. She had not come here expecting to find her mother. She thought about Raymond, who had said what would Eleanor do with an old farmhouse. She thought about Daniel, who had said that place is a ruin. She thought about Courtney, whose face she could see clearly even now, the way she had arranged her concern at the will reading, at every phone call after, the patience of a woman waiting for an obstacle to remove itself from the path. None of them had looked at the farmhouse and seen anything worth having. They had been looking for the wrong things. She rose and went back to the first painting, the summer pasture, and unwrapped it fully and carried it to the west window and held it in the last of the afternoon light. She knew very little about the art market. She knew that paintings could be worth very little or very much depending on factors she did not fully understand. She knew that her mother's work, judged only by what her own eyes could see, was serious and skilled and singular. She knew that serious and skilled and singular did not always translate to monetary worth, but she also knew that 50 years of unknown work by a painter who had simply vanished from a record she had once been part of, showed at galleries before her marriage. The notebook had mentioned 2 shows and a review that had said something Vera had underlined, was the kind of thing that people in certain rooms paid attention to. She needed to know what she had. She spent 3 more hours in the attic that evening, until the light was fully gone and the bare bulb overhead made the work look different, flatter, stripped of the depth that natural light gave it. She documented what she could with her phone, photographing each wrapped piece in its position along the walls, taking close pictures of the canvases where the wrapping had slipped. She photographed the work table, the color studies pinned above it, the brushes in their cup. She found, in the table's single drawer, a small stack of papers, exhibition programs, 2 of them, from 1954 and 1956. A clipping from a newspaper, the review Vera had mentioned, dated April 1956. And a letter, typed on a letterhead she had to hold close to read, from a gallery in the city. She read the letter standing at the work table in the attic of her dead mother's farmhouse. The letter was dated June 14, 1958. It was addressed to Miss Vera Alcott. It was from a man named Philip Crane, director, and it said that he had received her letter with regret, that he understood her decision, that he hoped she would reconsider, that the work she had shown with them was of a quality that deserved continued attention, that in his view she was making a mistake she would not be able to undo. The last paragraph said, "I am holding the 3 works you left with us pending your instructions. Please advise how you wish to proceed." There were 3 works at a gallery in 1958 that had never been reclaimed. Eleanor set the letter down carefully. She looked at the window, at the darkness that had come while she read. She thought about 1958. Her parents had married in 1959. The timeline arranged itself plainly. Vera had written to the gallery and withdrawn from showing her work in June of 1958, a year before she married. Had locked the farmhouse and moved to town and become something different than she had been, and had never explained why, not to Eleanor, not to anyone Eleanor knew of. She picked up the letter and put it in her pocket with the sketch of the kitchen garden. She turned off the attic light and came down the stairs. She locked the attic door out of habit, holding the skeleton key in her palm afterward for a moment, the small weight of it. Biscuit was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with the air of someone who had been waiting for an unreasonable amount of time and wished this noted. She made soup for supper and sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the notebook open side by side, reading them together. Vera had been in her late 20s when she gave up showing her work. The gallery's letter made clear that the work was not the reason. The director had not been writing to someone whose work had been found wanting. He had been writing to someone who had chosen, deliberately, to stop. The letter's last line, "I hope someday you will reconsider," had the feeling of a door left deliberately ajar by someone who did not believe the absence would be permanent. It had been permanent. Eleanor thought about what it cost to make that choice. To gather years of work, carry it to the farmhouse, lock the door, and take the key. To marry and move to town and say only, briefly and without detail, that she had done some painting as a young woman but had not pursued it seriously. The distance between what had actually happened and what Vera had said when asked was the distance between a life and a story about a life. The notebook did not explain it. The letter from the gallery did not explain it. But the farmhouse did. The attic with its 100-odd paintings stacked in careful rows, wrapped with the attention of someone who intended them to survive, did. Vera had not destroyed the work. She had not given it away or sold it or left it to deteriorate. She had wrapped each piece with care and stacked it in a dry room with good air and locked the door and paid the property taxes on the land for 40 years until she died and left it to the one daughter she thought would be patient enough to find it. That was not the behavior of someone who had decided the work did not matter. That was the behavior of someone who had decided that the right time had not come yet. Eleanor closed the notebook. She folded the letter back into its creases and set it on top. Outside, the night was full and quiet, the tree frogs going, a light wind moving in the pines at the east edge of the property. She sat at the table for a while in the good silence of the farmhouse and let the size of what she had found arrange itself in her mind without trying to direct it. Then she thought about what needed doing. She needed to know the name of the gallery, whether it still existed, whether a man named Philip Crane was findable, whether 3 paintings left with a gallery in 1958 were still, in any form, accounted for. She needed to understand what her mother had shown and where, and whether the work in this attic was documented anywhere in the public record. She needed to talk to someone who knew about art, about the market, about what it meant when a painter simply vanished from the record and the record had to be reconstructed. She did not rush this. She had learned from Vera, or tried to, that patience was not the absence of movement but the shape movement took when you understood what you were doing. She went to bed at 10 and lay in the east bedroom listening to the farmhouse settle. The old walls made the sounds that old structures make, the adjustments of wood and temperature change, the small conversations of a house that has stood for 100 years and knows how to stand for 100 more. She had slept here as a child during summer visits, had lain in this same room and heard these same sounds and felt, even then, that the farmhouse knew things the apartment in town did not. She had been right, as it turned out, though not in any way she could have anticipated. She thought about the painting of the summer pasture. The sureness of it. The way the figure in the middle distance was both specific and open, present without being defined. She thought about all the people who had driven past this farmhouse over the past 30 years without knowing what was locked above their sight line. Raymond, who had said what would Eleanor do with a ruin. Daniel, who had called it a place to wait for time to pass. Courtney, who had never mentioned it at all, which meant she had noticed it and dismissed it in the same breath, not worth the thought. She thought about her mother standing at the work table on a winter afternoon, looking out at the pasture, mixing the exact color that the pasture held in February light, noting it on a small rectangle of paper and pinning it to the wall. Working with total seriousness towards something that no one would see for decades. You were always the patient one. She put her hand flat on the bed beside her in the dark, a gesture she still made sometimes without thinking, reaching for Gerald, finding instead only the familiar slight dip of the mattress where no one was. She let her hand rest there. Then she closed her eyes and slept. In the morning she made tea and sat at the kitchen table with her phone and searched for Crane Gallery and the city name and 1950s. On the third search variation she found a result, Crane Gallery, established 1948, closed 1971 upon the retirement of founder Philip Crane. A brief entry in an arts database, no images, only the dates and a short list of artists shown. She scrolled the list. Vera Alcott. 1954, 1956. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she searched the name again, separately, and found a reference in a digitized review from a regional arts publication, 1956, which said of an exhibition, among the newer voices here, Alcott demonstrates a command of light unusual in a painter still in the early years of her career. The work rewards patience. She is one to watch. The review had been published and then nothing. No subsequent mentions, no reviews, no exhibitions. Vera Alcott disappeared from the record in 1958 and had not re-entered it. Until now. She called the County Historical Society. A woman named Dolores answered on the second ring, and Eleanor explained that she was looking for any records connected to the Crane Gallery or its collection following its 1971 closure. Dolores said she would look, asked for a number, called back 40 minutes later. The Crane Gallery's estate, she said, had been handled by an auction house at the time of Philip Crane's death in 1974. Most of the gallery's inventory had been sold. However, a portion of works for which ownership was disputed or unclear had been placed in storage pending resolution. That storage had been transferred, with records, to the University Art Museum's archives in 1989. Eleanor wrote this down on the back of the brown paper grocery list she had found in the drawer, on the back of Vera's handwriting. She called the University Art Museum. She was transferred twice before reaching a woman named Dr. Patricia Good, who oversaw the archives and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent years in rooms where things were older than they appeared. Eleanor explained who she was and who her mother had been and what she had found in the attic on Grover Road. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Good said, "Vera Alcott was your mother?" "Yes. We have 3 of her paintings in our archive. They came with the crane materials in 1989. They've been documented but never exhibited. We haven't been able to locate an estate or heir to establish clear ownership." Eleanor looked at the attic door at the top of the stairs, visible from where she sat at the kitchen table. "I believe I can establish that," she said. "I have documentation. A deed in my name, a will, a letter from Philip Crane addressed to my mother dated 1958, and her notebooks." Another pause. "Mrs. Marsh," Dr. Good said, her voice now carrying a different quality, something between professional care and genuine excitement pressed down into professional form, "how many paintings are in the attic?" Eleanor looked up at the ceiling. Counted what she had counted. "More than 100, she said. "I haven't finished the inventory." The silence from Dr. Good lasted 3 full seconds. "I'd like to come and see them," she said. "At your earliest convenience." They arranged it for Thursday. Eleanor hung up and sat at the table in the quiet kitchen with the morning light coming in through the unwashed glass and the sound of Biscuit moving somewhere in the house and the feeling of something enormous beginning to move, slowly, the way a ship at anchor begins to move when the tide comes. She picked up the skeleton key from the table where she had left it and turned it in her fingers. A small thing, ordinary, the kind that opened and closed things for 100 years in 1,000 houses and was never noticed. She set it on the sill in the kitchen window where the light would hit it. Then she put the kettle on. Thursday was 3 days away. She had work to do. Thursday came in cold and clear, the kind of October morning that sharpens everything at the edges. Eleanor had spent the 2 days between the phone call and Dr. Good's visit working in the attic. Not unwrapping everything, not yet, but cataloging. She moved along each wall methodically, numbering the pieces with small strips of masking tape and a marker, noting dimensions where she could read them from the frames, noting the subjects where the wrapping had slipped enough to see. She filled 3 pages of a yellow legal pad in her careful hand. When she was done, the count was 114 pieces. 14 of them were large format, over 3 feet in any dimension. 41 were mid-size. The rest were smaller works, studies, and finished pieces both. 114 paintings by a woman the art world had last heard from in 1958. She had cleaned the west window with vinegar and old newspaper until the glass was as clear as its age would allow. She had swept the attic floor and carried 2 broken cane chairs down to the barn. She had arranged a path from the stairs to the work table that could be walked without disturbing the stacked pieces. She wanted Dr. Good to see the attic as it was, not staged, not performed, but clear enough to be seen properly. She did not tell Daniel about Thursday. She did not tell anyone. Dr. Patricia Good arrived at 9:30 in a dark green car that navigated the gravel lane with the careful attention of someone unused to unpaved roads. She was 60, perhaps, trim and precise-looking in a wool coat, her gray hair cut close, her eyes the kind that move quickly and record accurately. She had brought a younger colleague, a man she introduced as Marcus, who carried a camera bag and a flat case of equipment and said very little beyond hello. Eleanor took their coats and made tea and carried it to the kitchen table without ceremony. Dr. Good looked around the kitchen with the practiced attention of someone who understood that rooms held information. She said, "How long has the property been in your family?" Eleanor said, "My mother was born here. She left in her late 20s and kept the land. She died 15 years ago and left it to me." "And you've been here how long?" 6 weeks, Eleanor said. Dr. Good looked at her directly. "And in 6 weeks you found all of this?" "I found a tin box in the garden first," Eleanor said. "A photograph and a notebook." The attic came after. She led them upstairs. At the attic door, Dr. Good paused the way Eleanor had paused, the same instinct, the same understanding that what was on the other side of a door deserved a moment before entry. Then she went in. She did not speak for a long time. She moved along the left wall slowly, lifting cloth, opening paper at corners, reading what was there. Marcus followed several feet behind, quiet, photographing what she indicated with small gestures. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs and let them work. She had carried the summer pasture painting to the work table and leaned it against the wall beneath the west window, already unwrapped, because she wanted Dr. Good to see it in the right light. Dr. Good reached at last. She stood in front of it for what Eleanor counted as nearly 4 minutes. She tilted her head. She stepped back. She stepped forward again. She put on a pair of reading glasses she had not worn before and looked at the surface of the paint from an angle, studying the brushwork. Then she took the glasses off and stood back again and looked at the hole. She said, quietly and not to anyone in particular, "Where has she been?" Then she turned to Eleanor. "Your mother showed twice with Philip Crane," she said. 1954 and 1956. The 1956 review in the Hartwell Quarterly called her work singular. That was not a word that publication used easily. After 1958 there is nothing. No shows, no sales records, no mentions in any correspondence I've found. She simply stopped. Eleanor said, "She didn't stop. She came here." Dr. Good looked at the walls around her, at the covered shapes in their long rows. "Yes," she said. "She came here." She was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Marsh, do you have any sense of what you have?" Eleanor said, "I know what I can see. I don't know what it means in any formal sense." Dr. Good said, "What you have is a body of work by a painter who was on the edge of serious recognition in the mid-1950s and then vanished entirely. In the art world, that kind of disappearance creates a particular kind of silence. When the work surfaces again, especially work of this quality, and especially in this quantity, it doesn't enter the conversation quietly." Eleanor looked at the summer pasture painting in the west window light. "What does that mean practically?" she said. Dr. Good said, "It means I'd like to bring an appraiser here. Someone I trust, someone who knows this period and this region's painters. It means I'd like to speak to our acquisitions committee about the 3 pieces in our archive and their relationship to this collection. And it means, Mrs. Marsh, that you should speak to a lawyer before you do anything else. Not because I intend anything other than what I'm saying, but because what is in this attic is significant and you should have proper counsel before any of it moves." Eleanor nodded. She had already looked up 2 names. Marcus had filled 2 memory cards. They stayed for 3 hours. Before they left, Dr. Good stood one more time in front of the summer pasture painting and said, "She understood what light does to longing. That's a rare thing to understand. Rarer still to paint it." Eleanor did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. She walked them to their car and watched them back down the lane. Then she went inside and stood in the kitchen and put both hands flat on the table. The skeleton key was still on the sill in the window, catching the midday light. The appraiser came 11 days later. His name was Robert Ashe, and he had the manner of a man who had seen a great deal and had learned to contain his reactions to what he saw, a professional stillness that served him well in rooms where money and emotion occupied the same space. He spent 6 hours in the attic. He worked with a magnifier and a small lamp and took his own notes and photographs and spoke very little during the process. Eleanor made soup and read in the kitchen and did not go upstairs. Whatever Robert Ashe was doing required the attic to itself. He came down at 4 in the afternoon and sat across from her at the kitchen table and opened his notes. He said, "I've done a preliminary examination. A full assessment will take longer and require controlled conditions for some of the larger pieces. But I can tell you what I'm seeing." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. He said, "The work is consistent with what we know of the period and region. The materials are consistent with pre-1960 production. The style development across the collection is coherent, The kind of progression you see in a painter who worked seriously and continuously over many years. There is no indication of any piece here being anything other than what it appears to be. He looked at his notes. He said, the 3 works at the University Archive, which I've also examined, are of comparable quality to the strongest pieces in this attic. Those 3 have some provenance documentation through the Crane Gallery records. This collection does not, except through the deed, the will, and the personal papers you've shown me. Establishing clear provenance for 114 pieces will take time. How much time? Eleanor said. Months, he said. Done properly. But it can be done. Your mother's exhibition records, the Crane correspondence, the review in the Hartwell Quarterly, the notebook, the photograph, the physical evidence of the studio here, that is a strong documentary foundation. He closed his notes. He said, a single mid-size painting from this period by a documented regional painter with serious critical attention before disappearance, quality consistent with what I'm seeing here, would typically enter auction in the range of $40,000 to $90,000. Possibly more. Depending on the market and the institutional interest at the time. Work of this quality, with the story that accompanies it, an unknown body of work recovered intact, tends to attract attention that affects value. Eleanor was quiet. He said, I don't want to give you numbers that aren't grounded yet. What I can tell you is that what is in that attic is not nothing. It is very far from nothing. She thanked him. He left his card and said he would follow up in writing within the week. She walked him to his car and came back inside and sat in the kitchen until the light changed. She had not called Daniel. She had not told Raymond. She had made 2 appointments with a lawyer named Susan Beale, who specialized in estate and intellectual property matters and who had listened to Eleanor's summary on the first call with focused attention and had said, bring everything you have in writing. She had brought everything. Susan Beale was thorough. She reviewed the deed, the will, the Crane letter, the exhibition programs, Robert Ashe's preliminary notes, Dr. Good's written follow-up, and the notebook. She spent 2 weeks researching the specific questions of copyright, estate ownership, and provenance documentation. When she called Eleanor back, she spoke for 40 minutes and answered every question Eleanor had written on her legal pad. The paintings belonged to Eleanor. All of them. The 3 at the University Archive belonged to her as well, their status as unclaimed works resolving cleanly in her favor given the documented chain of ownership. The copyright in the work, which had never been transferred, registered, or otherwise conveyed, had passed through Vera's estate to Eleanor as sole heir of the property. Eleanor owned the paintings, owned the copyright, and owned the right to determine how and whether the work entered the public record. She sat with this for a week before she made any further calls. She needed to think about what Vera would have wanted. This was not a simple question. Vera had locked the door. That was a fact. But she had also left Eleanor the key, eventually, and had written "You were always the patient one," which was not the language of someone who intended permanence in the locking. She had maintained the farmhouse. Had paid the taxes. Had wrapped each piece with care. She had not destroyed anything. She had preserved everything. Eleanor thought about the letter from Philip Crane. I hope you will reconsider. The door he had left ajar. She thought about the review, the work rewards patience. She thought about Vera at 25, arm raised mid-sentence, standing in front of her canvases with the self-possession of someone who had not yet been told to make herself smaller. She thought about what it might have cost her mother to make herself smaller, and for how long, and whether the farmhouse on Grover Road had been both a sacrifice and a refusal, the work locked away but not destroyed, hidden but not gone, waiting in the specific way that things wait when they belong to someone patient. She called Dr. Good. The conversation was long and specific and, by the end of it, had the shape of something real. The University Museum was interested in organizing a retrospective exhibition of Vera Alcott's work, the first exhibition of her paintings in 68 years. Dr. Good had spoken with the acquisitions committee. They wanted to propose a long-term loan arrangement for a significant portion of the attic collection, the 3 archive pieces forming the nucleus. The exhibition would be accompanied by a catalogue, properly researched and documented, that would enter Vera's name into the permanent art historical record. They were not proposing to purchase the work. That would be Eleanor's decision, if and when she chose. Eleanor said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she called Dr. Good and said yes. It was Raymond who called first, after the press release went out. The university had issued a brief statement about the forthcoming exhibition, naming the artist, naming the collection size, noting that it had been discovered at the family property by the artist's daughter. Raymond called Eleanor on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has received information they feel they should have received earlier and through different channels. He said, "Eleanor, what is this I'm reading?" She said, "Exactly what it says." He said, "Mother's paintings. In that farmhouse. All this time." "Yes," Eleanor said. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "This involves the family." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about Raymond at the will reading, and the years before that, and what he had said about the farmhouse. She thought about the evening she had sat on the barn step with the tin box in her lap and read her mother's handwriting and felt the full weight of what Vera had chosen and what she had carried alone. She said, "Raymond, when Mother died and left the farmhouse to me, you said what would Eleanor do with a ruin?" She said, "I kept paying the taxes on that ruin for 15 years. She said, "I found what was in it." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not keeping anything from you that is yours. The farmhouse was left to me specifically. The work was inside it. If you want to come to the exhibition when it opens, I would be glad to see you there." He said her name once, without anything attached to it. Then he said goodbye. Daniel called 4 days later. She had expected this call. She had, if she was honest with herself, been prepared for it for several weeks. She knew the shape of what Daniel would say before he said it, knew the particular arrangement of concern and recalibration that would come through the phone. He said, "Mom, I've been reading about the exhibition." She said, "Yes." He said, "This is extraordinary." He said, "Why didn't you tell me what you'd found?" He used the word "we" once, carefully, in the middle of a sentence about the family legacy, and she noticed it the way you notice a card turned over to a different face. She said, "Daniel, I'd like to tell you something." He said, "Of course." She said, "When your father died and I was not myself, I trusted you to manage what needed managing. I signed what you put in front of me because you were my son and I believed that was enough reason." She said, "I understand now that it was not." She said, "The house on Birchwood Lane is gone and I have made my peace with that because the farmhouse is mine and what is in it is mine and I am not going to pretend that what happened was a misunderstanding." He was very quiet. She said, "I don't want an argument and I don't want an apology right now. I want you to understand that I know what happened, and I want you to know that I'm all right. More than all right." He said, "Mom." His voice had changed. The managed quality was gone from it. She said, "Come to the exhibition if you want to. Bring Courtney if you want to. I'll be there." She hung up and stood at the west window of the kitchen and looked out at the pasture in the November light and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled for a long time. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in March. Eleanor arrived early, before the public doors opened, and walked through the gallery with Dr. Good in the quiet of an empty room. The paintings had been hung with care, lit with the kind of precision that let each piece speak at its own level. The summer pasture painting had been given the center wall of the main room, large enough to be seen from the doorway, the figure in the middle distance visible from across the space. Eleanor stood in front of it for a long time. Vera at 25, working in the attic on a summer afternoon, understanding what light does to longing and putting it on canvas with a sureness that had not diminished in 60 years of waiting in a closed room. Her mother's hand in every mark. Her mother's eye in every choice of what to include and what to leave out. Her mother's understanding that patience was not the absence of movement but the shape movement took when you knew what you were doing. People filed in at 10. Eleanor stood to one side and watched them move through the room. She watched their faces change as they went from painting to painting, The small visible adjustments that happened when something reached a person through the eyes and kept going. She watched a woman stop in front of the kitchen interior and stand there for a long time with her hand pressed to her sternum the way people do when something has found the right place in them. She saw Daniel come in at 11, Courtney beside him, both of them moving carefully through the room in the particular way of people navigating unfamiliar ground. Daniel found her near the back wall. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at the paintings around him, at the room full of people quietly encountering his grandmother's life's work, at the catalogue in his hand with Vera Alcott's name on the cover and Eleanor's name in the acknowledgements. He said, "Mom. She's extraordinary." Eleanor said, "She always was." He said, "I'm sorry." Just that, simply, without arrangement around it. She looked at him for a moment. Her son. The boy who had cried at films until he was 12 and had a bird notebook and had been stubborn about honesty until he learned not to be. She thought about what people were capable of that you could not see ahead of time, and about the other side of that, what they were capable of returning to. She said, "I know." She said, "Look at what she made." He looked. After a while, his eyes were wet and he did not do anything about it, and she thought this was the most honest she had seen him in years. Courtney said nothing directly to Eleanor. She moved through the room with the careful interest of someone recalibrating in real time, the distance between what she had dismissed and what stood around her in the gallery light too large to cross with small talk. Eleanor did not require anything of her. The work was doing what work does when it has waited long enough and is finally seen. It required nothing of anyone except attention. Susan Beale called the following week with the outcome of the first auction. For mid-size paintings, carefully chosen to represent the range of the collection, had gone to a specialist auction house in the city. Robert Ashe had done the full documentation. The catalog entries had been precise and thorough. There had been institutional interest, 2 museums, and a private collector known for work from this period. The 4 paintings realized a combined total of $423,000. Eleanor sat in the kitchen on Grover Road and heard this number and said nothing for a moment. Susan said, "This is only 4 pieces. Of 114. Eleanor looked at the skeleton key on the kitchen windowsill. She said, "What happens next is going to take some thought." Susan said, "That's exactly right. Take all the time you need." She had already decided some things. The farmhouse would stay. She had replaced the porch boards properly, hired a local man named Pete who worked carefully and did not talk too much. The bathroom had been replumbed. The kitchen window no longer stuck. She had planted garlic in Vera's kitchen garden in October, following the layout from the sketch on the brown paper bag. In spring she would put in tomatoes and the good green beans and the herbs her mother had grown, the ones she remembered from childhood visits. The bird feeder she had hung on the south side of the barn was already busy. She would fund the retrospective catalog herself, fully, so that the documentation of Vera's work would be thorough and permanent. She would donate 2 paintings to the University Museum, the summer pasture and the kitchen interior, so that her mother's work would have a permanent institutional home where anyone could come and see it. The rest she would steward carefully, the way her mother had stewarded it, but open now, the door unlocked, the work no longer sealed from the world it had been made in response to. She thought about the money. What it meant to be 77 years old and to have gone from a 60-day eviction notice to this kitchen on this morning. She thought about what Vera had said when Eleanor was 12 and crying over something she could no longer name. You can carry something heavy and still walk forward. The 2 things are not the same. She thought about all the things her mother had carried without naming them, the weight of a life smaller than the one she had been building in the attic, the faith that Eleanor would eventually be patient enough and curious enough to open the right door. She had been patient. It had mattered. She rose from the table and took the skeleton key from the sill and went upstairs. She passed the bedroom doors and walked to the end of the hall. She put the key in the lock and turned it and opened the attic door. She climbed the stairs and stood in the attic in the morning light from the east window, Biscuit coming up behind her with his customary air of having organized the whole thing. The room was different now. Half the walls were clear where paintings had been collected, catalogued, transported. The remaining work still stood in their rows, still wrapped, still waiting. The work table still held its residue of decades, the color studies still pinned above it, the brushes still in their cup. In the east window, the light came in wavy and old and made everything it touched a little more than itself. Eleanor stood in the center of the room and looked at what remained. Her mother had stood here and understood things that took other people decades to learn, and had wrapped that understanding in canvas and cloth and locked the door on it and trusted that patience was not the same as giving up, that what was sealed was not the same as what was lost. She had left the farmhouse and the deed and the key and a single line in a will and had trusted Eleanor to do the rest. The attic door was open. It would not be locked again. The work her mother had made in this room had been in the world for 2 months and had already changed things, had already moved through people in the way that true things move, reaching something that smaller things do not reach. Eleanor thought about what it meant to be seen, truly seen, even at a distance of 60 years, even through work rather than presence, even after a life of deliberate quietness. She thought about Vera at 80, or whatever age she had last stood in this room, looking at what she had made and knowing it was good and knowing also that the time for it had not yet come. The time had come now. Eleanor crossed to the work table and sat in the old chair that was still there, the one she had not moved because it felt wrong to move it, and looked out the west window at the pasture in the March light, the winter grass pale and the sky coming in clean after 3 days of rain. Somewhere below the west window, a woodpecker was working at something in the fence post, steady and purposeful. The tree line at the back of the pasture was beginning, if you looked carefully, to suggest the very first possibility of green. She sat at her mother's table in her mother's light and felt the weight she had been carrying for the past 6 months settle into something she recognized. Not gone, not lifted, but changed in nature. The grief of what had been taken was still there, Gerald's absence, the house on Birchwood Lane, the son she was still learning to see clearly. But grief and losing were not the same thing. She had been told this when she was 12 and had not fully understood it until now. She had not lost this. It had been waiting. She put her hand on the work table surface, on the dried paint, on the record of all the mornings her mother had stood here and worked and trusted the work to be enough, and felt the full and quiet fact of being here, in this room, at this table, her mother's daughter, the patient one, with the door open behind her and the light coming in through glass her mother had looked through and the pasture below unchanged and the morning still and full of what was possible. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.